turkey had been sitting on the counter for 40 minutes. I'd made enough for 14 people. Sweet potato casserole with the brown sugar crust my late wife Helen used to make every November. Green beans with bacon and almonds, the way my son-in-law claimed was his favorite. 2 pies, pumpkin and pecan, cooling on the rack by the window. The good china was out. I'd even ironed the tablecloth, something I hadn't done since Helen passed 3 years ago. By 2 in the afternoon, I started calling. My daughter Nora's phone went to voicemail. My son-in-law Brent picked up on the 3rd ring, said they were running a little behind, and hung up before I could ask how far behind. My son Owen, he lives 40 minutes away in Raleigh, didn't pick up at all. By 4 o'clock, I was eating turkey alone at a table set for 14. I didn't cry. I'm 63 years old. I spent 32 years as a civil engineer, raised 2 kids mostly by myself after Helen got sick, and buried my wife without falling apart in front of my children because they needed me steady. I don't cry easily anymore. But I sat at that table and I looked at Helen's china and I thought, when did this happen? When did I become someone people don't show up for? My name is Walter. No, sorry, I've gone by Hank my whole life. Harold on my birth certificate, but nobody's called me that since my mother. Hank Caldwell. I retired 2 years ago from a firm in Durham, North Carolina, where I'd worked since I was 31 years old. I have a house I've paid off, a pension, a vegetable garden in the backyard that Helen started, and I've kept going because it seemed wrong to let it die. I have 2 adult children. Nora is 34. Owen is 31. And apparently, I have Thanksgiving alone. Around 6 that evening, my phone buzzed. A photo. Posted publicly on Facebook. Brent had tagged it so it showed up in my feed. 14 people around a long table at a restaurant in Asheville, 3 hours away. Nora was laughing, her head tilted back the way she does. Owen was there too, his girlfriend beside him. Brent was at the head of the table, holding up a glass of wine like he was making a toast. The caption read, "Friendsgiving with the people who matter most." Grateful. I read it twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table, and I sat there in my kitchen with the good china and the cold turkey and the 2 pies. Nobody was coming to eat, and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do next. I want to be fair about Brent, because I know how easy it is to turn someone into a villain when you're hurt. I've seen that happen. I don't want to be the bitter old man who hated his son-in-law for no reason. So let me tell you what I actually observed, over time, in facts. Nora met Brent 4 years ago at a conference in Charlotte. She was working as a hospital administrator by then. Good job, good salary, the kind of professional trajectory Helen and I were proud of. Brent sold commercial real estate. He was charming in the way that some men are charming. He made you feel like the most interesting person in the room, right up until the moment he needed something from you, and then the warmth clicked off like a switch. The first year, things seemed fine. Brent came to Christmas. He helped me carry in firewood without being asked, which I noticed. He told stories well. I thought, okay, this might work. The second year, small things started shifting. Nora called less. When she did call, she sounded measured, careful, like she was choosing words. She used to call me when something funny happened, when a patient said something that made her laugh, when she had a bad day and needed to vent. Those calls stopped. Instead, I'd get texts, short ones, checking in, the kind of texts you send when someone else is reading over your shoulder. I mentioned it to Owen once. He shrugged and said Brent was particular about stuff. I asked what that meant. Owen got quiet and said he didn't want to get in the middle of it. By the 3rd year, Nora had left her hospital job. Brent had decided she should manage the back-end operations for his real estate business. Bookkeeping, scheduling, client communications. She was good at it, he said. It made more sense financially. She'd be around more. I listened to him explain this at Easter dinner, and I felt something cold settle in my chest because I knew what it meant, even if Nora didn't yet. It meant he controlled what she earned. It meant he could see every hour of her day. I didn't say this. I've learned that when a daughter is in love, her father's doubts sound like attacks. I waited. After Thanksgiving, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went back to the basics of how I used to solve problems at work, which is to say, I stopped reacting and started observing. I called Owen the Monday after Thanksgiving, and we had the longest conversation we'd had in 2 years. I didn't ask about Brent. I asked about Owen's life, his girlfriend, Priya, his job at the logistics company, whether he was happy. He talked for 40 minutes, which told me he'd been waiting for someone to ask. Toward the end, almost like he couldn't help himself, he said, "Dad, Thanksgiving wasn't my idea. I want you to know that." I said I figured as much. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Brent's been moving money around. Nora's money. I don't know details, but she mentioned something to Priya, and it didn't sound right." I thanked him, and I didn't push. I wrote down what he'd said in a notebook I keep by the kitchen phone, the way I used to take field notes on job sites. Date, time, exact words. Then I called my attorney. Lester Webb has handled my affairs for 15 years. Wills, property, a boundary dispute with a neighbor back in 2018. More importantly, Lester went to law school with a woman named Patricia Osei, who is, by most accounts, the sharpest family law attorney in Wake County. I told Lester I wasn't filing anything, wasn't doing anything dramatic. I just needed to understand what I was looking at. He put me in touch with Patricia the next week. I sat in her office and I said, "My daughter works for her husband's business. Her name is likely on joint accounts, and I have a second-hand report that money is being moved without her knowledge or consent. What am I looking at?" Patricia leaned back in her chair and said, "Potentially, quite a bit. Tell me more." The thing about this kind of situation, and Patricia told me this plainly, is that the money is usually just the surface. Underneath it, there's a pattern. You have to document the pattern. So I did. I started keeping notes every time I noticed something. Nora canceling plans at the last minute, always with an excuse that sounded like it came from someone else's mouth. Owen mentioning offhand that Brent had started handling all the bills, that Nora didn't have a card in her own name anymore. A comment Nora made in December when we finally did have dinner. Just the two of us, lunch at a place near her house while Brent was in Charlotte, where she said, "I don't really have access to the main account right now. Things are a little complicated," and laughed it off like it was nothing. I wrote it all down. I also hired someone. I want to be honest about that. I hired a licensed private investigator named Victor Solano, a retired Raleigh police detective who does domestic financial investigations now. I know how that sounds. I know some people will say I overstepped, but I'd watched enough of my daughter disappear in 3 years to know that asking politely wasn't going to get me answers. What Victor found over 6 weeks was this. Brent had opened 3 accounts in the past 18 months that Nora's name was not on. Money from the real estate business, including income from 2 properties Nora had helped acquire, using a portion of her own savings from her hospital career, was flowing into those accounts. Not all of it. Enough. There was also a woman in Charlotte. Victor didn't make a big deal out of this, just imputed it at the end of his report, 2 photos and a hotel record. I sat with that information for a long time before I decided how to use it. The financial piece was the important one. That was the part that could actually help Nora. The part that gave her options, leverage, a way out that didn't leave her broke and dependent. The rest was just the kind of hurt that doesn't need to be made into a weapon. Patricia reviewed Victor's full report in February. She said we had enough to pursue civil action for financial fraud if Nora chose to. She said, when Nora is ready, in a way that told me she'd seen this before, that readiness wasn't guaranteed, that I needed to be patient. I am not, by nature, a patient man, but I have learned to act like one. March came. Nora called me on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. She almost never called during the week anymore. Her voice had that tight, careful quality, but underneath it, something else, something that sounded like the edge of a decision. She said, "Dad, can I come over this weekend?" I said, "Of course. I'll make the chili you like." She arrived Saturday afternoon. She came alone. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd eaten Thanksgiving by myself 4 months earlier, and she wrapped her hands around a mug of coffee and she said, "I think something is really wrong with the money. I've been trying to figure it out for a while, and I can't." She stopped. "I feel stupid." I said, "You're not stupid." She said, "I should have seen it sooner." I said, "Brent is good at what he does. That's not a compliment." She looked up at me. I said, I have some information I want to share with you. I want you to know that I didn't go looking because I didn't trust you. I went looking because I love you, and I needed to know you were safe. I paused. Can I show you? She nodded. I got the folder from the shelf in my study, where I'd been keeping it since February. I set it on the table in front of her, and I sat back down and I let her read. She read for a long time. I refilled her coffee. I didn't say anything. When she got to the last page, the financial summary Patricia had prepared, showing the movement of funds, the accounts without her name, the approximate total. She set the papers down and she covered her mouth with her hand. She didn't cry right away. She stared at the table for probably a full minute. Then she said very quietly, "How much?" I told her the number. She closed her eyes. Then she cried. Not the way you cry about something sad. The way you cry when you've been holding something together for a long time and someone finally shows you it's okay to put it down. I didn't tell her about the woman in Charlotte that day. That could wait. The financial picture was enough for her to act on. The rest, I decided, was information she could have when she was ready, or never, if it didn't serve her. What happened over the next 3 months isn't a simple story. I want to be honest about that too. Nora didn't leave immediately. She went home that Saturday, and she spent 2 weeks sitting with what she'd read, and during those 2 weeks, she still went to work in Brent's office every morning and came home to their house every night. And I don't know what that cost her. I didn't ask. I called every few days, kept it short, told her I was here. Patricia had advised that the best move was to establish a separate account in Nora's name only, and to begin quietly removing her personal financial documents from the house, tax returns, pay stubs, anything with her social security number, before Brent had any indication she was preparing to act. Nora did this gradually, over several weeks. She came to my house twice with boxes that she left in my study. I didn't look inside them. They were hers. In April, Brent apparently noticed something. Nora told me later he'd come home one evening and gone through her purse, looking for the new debit card, she assumed. He didn't find it. He got cold. He got the kind of quiet that, she said, was worse than yelling. That was when she called me and said she needed to stay for a while. I had the guest room ready within the hour. The legal process is still ongoing, and I won't go into the details, because that's Nora's business, not mine. What I can tell you is that Patricia filed civil claims in May, and Brent's attorney has been the kind of busy that suggests they know the evidence is solid. Owen came to dinner in June with Priya. The 4 of us sat on the back porch and ate the same green beans with bacon and almonds I'd made for Thanksgiving, and nobody talked about Brent directly, and it was the best meal I'd had in years. At some point, Owen said, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't say more." "Earlier," I said, "you told me what I needed to know when I needed to know it." He said, "Still." I said, "Still nothing. You're here now." Priya, who I'd only met twice before, said, "Nora talks about you constantly. She says you're the reason she finally looked at the papers." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and ate my green beans. I'm not going to tell you everything turned out perfect. Nora has hard days. She spent 4 years of her life with that man, and you can't just rinse that off. She went back to work, a different hospital system, a director-level role she got on her own, which she deserved. She has her own account, her own card, her own schedule. These are small things that shouldn't feel like victories, but they do. She comes to dinner most Sundays now. Sometimes Owen and Priya come too. I've kept Helen's vegetable garden going, tomatoes, peppers, a row of basil that gets out of control every August. Nora came out to help me stake the tomatoes last month, and she said, "Mom would have loved that she kept doing this." I said, "She would have liked you too. She would have liked watching you figure yourself out." Nora leaned on the garden stake and looked at me. She said, "I'm sorry about Thanksgiving." I said, "I know." She said, "I knew it was wrong. I knew when we were at that restaurant. I just didn't know how to." She stopped. "I don't have a good excuse." I said, "You don't need one. We're past it." And we are. That's the thing about being 63 that I couldn't have understood at 40. You get better at telling the difference between the things that need to be resolved and the things that just need to be released, The hurt of that Thanksgiving, I released it. What I kept was the knowledge it gave me, that something was wrong, that my daughter needed help she couldn't ask for yet, and that the most useful thing I could do was be steady enough to provide it when the time came. I've never been good at grand gestures, never been a speeches and proclamations kind of man. What I am is consistent. I show up. I keep the garden going. I make chili on Saturday when someone needs somewhere to land. That turns out to be enough. This past November, Nora came over the Wednesday before Thanksgiving to help me cook. We made a smaller version, just enough for 5 people, because Owen and Pryor were coming, and Nora's friend Claudia, who'd helped her through the worst of the spring. We made the sweet potato casserole the way Helen used to make it. We did not make enough for 14. At some point in the evening, Nora looked around the table, at Owen, at Priya, at Claudia, at me, and she said, quietly, almost to herself, "This is what it's supposed to feel like." The turkey was still hot this time. People ask me sometimes, well, not strangers, but Owen has asked, and Nora once circled around it without quite saying it, whether I regret waiting so long, whether I should have confronted Brent earlier, said something at Easter when he explained why Nora was leaving her job, pushed harder when the phone calls stopped. I've thought about that a lot, and the honest answer is no. Not because I was passive, not because I didn't see it. I saw it clearly enough that it scared me, but I've lived long enough to understand that when you act before you're ready, when you rush at something because it's making you angry, you usually make it worse. You become the problem. Brent would have pointed at me and said exactly what men like him always say, that I was controlling, that I couldn't let my daughter live her own life, that I was the reason she was unhappy. And Nora, who was still in the middle of it, might have believed him. That's how it works. That's the mechanism. So I waited, I watched, I wrote things down, I called a lawyer before I called anyone else. That's not patience in the gentle Zen sense of the word. That's strategy. That's what 32 years of solving structural problems will teach you. You don't tear out a wall until you know what's behind it. You don't pull a load-bearing beam because you don't like how it looks. You assess first, you document, then you act, and when you act with everything you have. Brent made choices. He chose to move money that wasn't only his. He chose to cut Nora off from the work she'd built, from the independence she'd earned, from the people who loved her. He chose Asheville over my dining room table. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequence found him the way consequences always do. Not in a dramatic moment, not with shouting, but quietly, in the form of a folder laid on a kitchen table by a 63-year-old man who had simply been paying attention. That's the thing I want to say clearly. Intelligence without integrity is just cleverness, and cleverness runs out. Brent was clever. He was very good at managing appearances, but he wasn't careful in the way that honest people are careful, because honest people don't have to be. He left traces because he thought no one was looking. He underestimated me because I was quiet. A lot of people make that mistake. What I hope Nora takes from all of this, and I think she's getting there, slowly, the way real understanding arrives, is that her worth was never tied to what Brent said it was. He needed her to be smaller. He needed her uncertain, financially dependent, separated from the people who would have told her the truth. That's not love, that's architecture. He built a structure designed to hold her in place, and she lived inside it for 4 years before she started looking for the door. She found it herself in the end. I just made sure the light was on. Owen said something at dinner in June that I've kept turning over. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry I didn't say more." And I told him what I believed, that he said what he needed to say when it mattered. But afterward, I thought about what it costs people to stay silent when they're afraid of being pulled into something. Owen isn't a coward. He was careful in a situation where being careless would have helped no one. There's a difference. I'm not a perfect father. I was gone too much when they were young. I leaned on Helen too hard for the emotional labor and didn't notice until she got sick, and I had to pick it up myself. I have regrets that have nothing to do with Brent, but I showed up when it counted. I kept the door open. I made chili and kept the guest room ready and sat at a table set for 14 and ate alone rather than make a scene that would have pushed Nora further away. That turkey was cold. The table was full this year. Some things take time. The ones worth keeping usually do.